Hello, everyone. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. We'd love to connect with viewers from all around the world. Now, let's get into today's story.
HOA called cops. When I said I'm not in their HOA. Minutes later, I bought the land under them. The moment the police officer asked me if I lived here, I realized the most expensive mistake my HOA neighbors would ever make had already been signed, notarized, and recorded. The first thing I noticed wasn't the flashing red and blue lights washing across my front gate. It was the smell of fresh-cut cedar drifting through the cool Texas morning, while my cordless drill still rested on the tailgate of my pickup. I'd been replacing a weathered fence post that had survived longer than most of the houses behind it. Gravel crunched beneath polished dress shoes as three officers walked toward me, followed by a woman wearing a perfectly pressed white blazer that somehow stayed spotless despite the dusty ranch road. Diane Holloway, president of Willow Creek Estates HOA, smiled the way people smile when they think victory is already guaranteed. She folded her arms and pointed straight at me before I had a chance to say a single word. "That's him, officers. He's refusing to obey community regulations and trespassing on HOA property." I looked from her to the deputies and couldn't help letting out the smallest laugh. The oldest officer raised an eyebrow. "Sir, do you live at this address?" "Every day," I answered. "Are you a member of Willow Creek Estates HOA?" "No, sir." Diane's smile widened as if she'd been waiting for those exact words. "See? He admits it. He refuses to join the HOA, refuses to comply, and keeps interfering with our neighborhood entrance." I brushed sawdust from my jeans and looked directly at her. "I'm not in your HOA because my property has never been part of your subdivision." For just a second, complete silence settled over the road, except for the distant hum of sprinklers somewhere beyond the decorative stone entrance her board loved showing off in real estate brochures. Then Diane laughed, not a nervous laugh, the kind of confident laugh that comes from someone who believes authority belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. "Everyone around here answers to this HOA eventually," she said. "Even you." She had no idea that less than 30 minutes earlier, I'd walked out of the county recorder's office, holding paperwork that would quietly erase every ounce of certainty from her voice. I didn't interrupt her speech. I didn't argue. I simply watched the morning breeze carry dust across the entrance monument, while sunlight reflected off the bronze neighborhood sign. Most people standing there saw expensive landscaping, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a prestigious gated community. I saw survey markers, legal boundaries, forgotten parcel numbers, and a 70-year-old paperwork mistake that nobody had noticed until I started asking questions. Funny thing about land, it never cares who shouts the loudest. It only cares whose name is written on the deed. Diane thought she owned the entrance to her perfect little kingdom. She didn't know the ground beneath her polished heels had already changed hands before she ever dialed 911. My name is Ethan Walker, and until 2 years ago my life revolved around highway projects, drainage reports, and county survey maps instead of neighborhood politics. I spent almost 18 years as a civil engineer, the kind of guy who noticed property pins sticking half an inch above the dirt, while everyone else admired the scenery. My father used to joke that I could read a plat map faster than most people could read a restaurant menu. He was the one who taught me that every fence, every gravel road, and every old oak tree usually had a story buried underneath it. When he passed away, he left me enough money to finally stop chasing contracts and start looking for a place where mornings sounded like birds instead of traffic. That search brought me to 23 acres just outside Austin, tucked beside a polished subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. Most buyers ignored the property because it looked awkward on paper. The land wrapped around one side of the neighborhood like the letter L, with an old ranch road cutting across the eastern edge before ending near a weathered equipment shed that had probably been standing since the 1970s. To me, it was perfect. The place smelled like cedar after every rainstorm. Wildflowers covered the open pasture each spring, and at sunset, the entire western ridge turned the color of old copper. I bought it without negotiating a single dollar, because I knew value when I saw it. My plan was simple: restore the fence lines, repair the old barn one section at a time, build a modest workshop, where I could spend weekends restoring antique surveying equipment that my father had collected over 40 years. I was not looking for conflict. I was looking for quiet. The first few weeks felt exactly like the fresh start I needed. Every morning I walked the property with a cup of black coffee, while dew soaked through my boots and meadowlarks filled the air with the kind of songs you never hear inside city limits. Then I started noticing strange things. Fresh tire tracks crossed my pasture after every weekend. Landscaping crews drove across my access road without asking. Decorative banners advertising community events appeared suspiciously close to my fence line before quietly disappearing on Monday mornings. At first, I assumed it was an honest mistake. After all, boundaries can look different from behind the wheel of a maintenance truck. Then one afternoon, I found bright orange survey paint sprayed directly onto one of my corner markers. Someone had tied a small ribbon around the steel rod with the words, "Future Entrance Expansion," written across the attached tag. I remember running my thumb across the faded metal cap that had been placed there decades before I ever owned the property. The marker was exactly where every recorded survey said it should be. The ribbon, however, told me somebody nearby had started believing ownership worked better with assumptions than with deeds. That tiny strip of orange plastic was the first warning that my peaceful piece of Texas was about to become the center of someone else's very expensive misunderstanding. Diane Holloway did not become president of Willow Creek Estates because she loved volunteering. She became president because nobody else enjoyed control as much as she did. Around town, she sold luxury homes with polished smiles and perfectly rehearsed promises about peaceful suburban living. But inside the neighborhood, everyone knew the real currency was not property values. It was her approval. She drove a pearl-white sport utility vehicle that somehow always looked freshly detailed, even after driving dusty county roads. Every Friday afternoon, she made slow laps around the subdivision in that vehicle, waving at homeowners with one hand while holding a clipboard in the other. Children stopped riding bicycles across freshly seeded lawns whenever they saw her coming. Delivery drivers learned not to park for more than a few minutes. Even lawn crews lowered the volume on their radios. The entire neighborhood seemed to breathe differently whenever Diane appeared. I noticed the pattern before I ever met her. One older gentleman named Frank introduced himself while checking his mailbox. He glanced toward the clubhouse before speaking quietly. He warned me that if I ever received a letter with the HOA logo, I should keep every envelope because Diane believed paperwork could accomplish anything. I laughed at the time because I assumed he was exaggerating. 3 days later, the first certified letter arrived in my mailbox. The paper smelled like fresh printer ink as I unfolded it across my kitchen counter. According to the notice, I owed annual HOA dues, landscaping compliance fees, architectural review penalties, and late charges for failing to register my property with the association. I read every page twice before smiling to myself. They had addressed the letter to the correct owner and the correct address. The only problem was that my legal description did not appear anywhere inside the subdivision boundaries. I placed the documents back into the envelope and drove to the clubhouse the following morning. The building itself looked impressive, wrapped in limestone with tall windows reflecting the bright Texas sky. Flower beds surrounded the entrance, and an American flag moved gently above the parking lot. Diane greeted me before I reached the front door, smiling as though we had already settled the matter. I politely explained that my property had never been annexed into Willow Creek Estates, and that the county plat clearly showed separate boundaries. Her smile never changed. She simply folded her hands together and replied, "Maps can be interpreted in different ways, but community standards apply to everyone around us." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Engineers do not interpret boundary lines. Surveyors do not interpret recorded deeds. Land either belongs to someone or it does not. Yet Diane spoke about ownership the same way people discuss opinions over coffee. Before the week ended, another notice appeared, this time demanding that I remove my unapproved ranch gate because it disrupted the neighborhood entrance aesthetic. Standing beside that old cedar gate as the evening wind carried the scent of fresh hay across the pasture, I finally understood something important. Diane was not trying to understand where my property ended. She had already convinced herself that every acre she could see naturally belonged under her authority. The letters kept coming every few days, each one thicker than the last, each one carrying another imaginary violation that somehow existed only inside the Willow Creek Estates office. One demanded that I replace my mailbox because it did not match approved community colors. Another informed me that my split-rail fence violated neighborhood architectural harmony. Then came a notice ordering me to submit landscape improvement plans before planting additional trees on my own ranch. Every envelope carried the same polished logo, the same confident language, and the same assumption that repeating something often enough could somehow make it legally true. I stopped responding altogether. Instead, I filed every letter inside a weatherproof binder that stayed on the corner of my workshop bench beside my father's old transit level. Documentation had solved more engineering problems than arguments ever could. Diane, however, interpreted silence as surrender. The following Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of diesel engines idling near the entrance road. The low rumble rolled across the pasture before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. When I drove toward the gate, 2 landscaping trucks were unloading stacks of decorative stone and freshly painted wooden signs. Workers had already placed bright orange traffic cones across my gravel access road, while another crew measured distances with tape reels stretched across the entrance. I stepped out of my truck, smelling fresh mulch mixed with damp earth, and asked the foreman what project they were working on. He handed me a printed work order signed by Diane Holloway. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Community Entrance Expansion." I calmly pointed to the survey marker standing less than 3 feet from where they intended to dig. The foreman frowned, checked his paperwork again, and quietly admitted he had been told the entire entrance belonged to the association. I asked him one simple question: "Did anyone show you a recorded survey?" He looked down without answering. The crew packed their equipment and left before noon, but Diane was waiting for me at the clubhouse parking lot that afternoon. She stood beside her vehicle wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky, speaking with the practiced confidence of someone who had never been forced to hear the word no. She accused me of delaying neighborhood improvements and lowering property values. I reminded her, politely, that improvements could not legally begin on land the association did not own. Her expression hardened for only a moment before returning to that familiar smile. "Ownership disputes can always be sorted out later," she replied. "Community progress cannot wait." That sentence bothered me more than every certified letter combined. A week later, security guards appeared near the entrance during weekend open houses, politely directing visitors away from my access road, while telling prospective buyers that the surrounding acreage would eventually become community green space. One young couple even apologized after accidentally driving onto my property because they had been told the ranch belonged to the future expansion area. I realized then that Diane was no longer simply enforcing rules. She was creating a version of reality that repeated itself often enough for strangers to believe it. Every sign, every conversation, every brochure slowly erased the actual boundary lines until fiction started sounding more convincing than the county records themselves. By the beginning of the second month, I finally stopped assuming common sense would solve the problem. I hired a local real estate attorney, laid every certified letter across a polished oak conference table, and watched him read through the growing stack while the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Every few minutes he nodded, occasionally circling a sentence with his pen, before sliding another page into a separate pile. When he finished, he leaned back and said something that surprised me. "The law is on your side. The difficult part is convincing everyone else before this turns into an expensive court fight." Those words stayed with me during the long drive home. The law and reality are not always introduced to each other at the same speed. My attorney sent a formal response, demanding that the association immediately stop issuing notices to property outside its recorded jurisdiction. Diane answered less than a week later, with another letter from a larger law firm, this one filled with polished legal language, suggesting that historical use, community reliance, and future development plans justified the association's actions. It sounded impressive until I noticed that not a single sentence identified an actual recorded deed supporting her claims. Even so, the letters accomplished exactly what she wanted. Contractors became hesitant about accepting work on my property. A fencing company canceled an installation after being told there was an unresolved ownership dispute. A delivery driver refused to unload construction lumber until I signed additional paperwork confirming responsibility for potential legal conflicts. The smell of fresh-cut pine lingered around the unopened trailer for nearly a week because nobody wanted to become involved. Then county offices started becoming strangely cautious. One afternoon, I visited the planning department hoping to clarify utility access for a future workshop. The clerk recognized my address immediately. Her polite smile faded just enough for me to notice before she disappeared into a back office with my application. 10 minutes later, she returned and quietly explained that because of ongoing concerns raised by the neighboring association, additional reviews might be necessary before approving certain permits. I asked what legal documents supported those concerns. She admitted there was none on file, only repeated correspondence requesting the county examine possible boundary inconsistencies. Walking back across the parking lot, I could feel the afternoon heat rising from the pavement, while frustration settled heavier than the toolbox in the back of my truck. Diane had not proven anything. She had simply repeated the same story often enough that people began treating it like it might be true. Even neighbors who had once waved from their driveways now seemed uncertain whenever they saw me. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became polite instead of friendly. Nobody wanted to choose sides while the dispute continued. For the first time since buying the ranch, I wondered whether peace had become impossible, no matter how clearly the record supported me. That evening I sat alone on the old cedar porch, listening to crickets replace the daytime birds, while the fading sunlight stretched long shadows across the pasture. My father's transit level rested beside my chair, its brass fittings glowing softly in the last light of the day. He always believed that if measurements seemed wrong, you did not argue with the landscape. You went back to the original survey and started again from the first marker. Looking across the distant entrance to Willow Creek Estates, I realized I had been defending my property against the wrong question. Maybe it was finally time to start asking a different one altogether. The next morning I unlocked the county records archive just after it opened, carrying nothing more than a legal pad, a thermos of black coffee, and the quiet feeling that somewhere inside decades of paperwork, a simple fact had been buried beneath too many assumptions. The records room smelled like old paper, machine oil, and polished wood. Metal drawers lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one filled with surveys, deeds, easements, and subdivision plats that stretched back generations. Most people came searching for a single document. Engineers know better. Land tells its story one page at a time. I began with the original ranch surveys recorded long before Willow Creek Estates existed. Then I compared them against every subdivision filing, utility easement, tax parcel adjustment, and road dedication that followed over the next 40 years. Hour after hour, one detail kept catching my attention: the neighborhood entrance, clubhouse, visitor parking lot, and decorative stone monument all sat inside the same oddly shaped parcel that seemed to disappear from one filing before quietly reappearing in another. That should not happen. Every transfer of ownership leaves a trail. This one looked as though someone had simply assumed the parcel had been included without ever confirming it. I requested the complete chain of title. The clerk disappeared into a secured storage room and returned carrying a thick binder covered in faded county labels. As I turned each brittle page, the pattern finally revealed itself. 26 years earlier, the original ranch owner had sold hundreds of acres to the developer building Willow Creek Estates. Hundreds of acres, but not all of them. One narrow parcel surrounding the future entrance had been intentionally excluded because it contained an old maintenance road and utility access reserved for future negotiations. The developer built anyway, apparently expecting the final transfer to happen later. It never did. Ownership remained with the rancher's family until his only surviving daughter passed away years later without direct heirs. The property entered probate, then tax administration, quietly slipping through the cracks while everyone assumed the association already owned it. Nobody checked, because nobody had a reason to question the landscaping, the clubhouse, or the impressive entrance signs that had stood there for years. I leaned back in my chair as sunlight poured through the archive windows, warming the faded survey maps spread across the table. Suddenly, every strange interaction over the past 2 months made perfect sense. Diane had spent years acting like the entrance belonged to the association, because everyone before her believed exactly the same thing. Confidence had replaced verification. Tradition had replaced documentation. Before leaving, I visited the county tax office one floor below. A supervisor confirmed that because the parcel had accumulated unpaid taxes through an abandoned estate, it had already been scheduled for a public tax foreclosure sale. The date was less than 3 weeks away. I thanked her, folded the official notice into my notebook, and walked outside into the warm Texas afternoon. The breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar across the courthouse square as I looked back toward Willow Creek Estates in the distance. For the first time since buying the ranch, I stopped thinking about defending my property. I started thinking about acquiring the one piece of land everyone else had forgotten to protect. For the next 3 weeks, I became the quietest man in the county, while Diane continued mailing violation notices and reminding everyone that community rules applied to me, whether I liked them or not. I stopped answering completely. Every envelope went into the same weatherproof binder that had grown thick enough to barely close. Instead of spending my mornings arguing, I spent them with title specialists, surveyors, and a probate attorney whose office overlooked the courthouse square. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with old leather law books every time I walked through his door, and every meeting ended the same way. Verify everything twice. That advice fit my father's philosophy perfectly. I ordered an independent title search covering every transfer connected to the forgotten parcel. Then I hired a licensed surveyor to compare the original ranch boundaries with modern satellite mapping and county records. A week later, he spread oversized plats across the hood of my pickup, while a warm breeze lifted the corners of the paper. He tapped the same oddly shaped parcel I had been studying and quietly smiled. "You found something most people never would," he said. "Everybody assumed ownership because the buildings have been standing here for years. Assumptions are not legal descriptions." Those words confirmed everything I needed to know. I transferred funds into a dedicated escrow account and completed the registration paperwork for the upcoming tax foreclosure sale. The process itself was surprisingly ordinary. No secret meetings, no dramatic negotiations, just signatures, identification, certified funds, and patience. That was the part Diane never understood. She believed power came from being the loudest person in the room. Real property law rarely makes any noise at all. Meanwhile, Willow Creek Estates grew even more confident. New banners appeared near the entrance, announcing upcoming neighborhood festivals. Contractors installed decorative lighting around the clubhouse. One Saturday afternoon, I watched volunteers planting rows of colorful flowers around the stone monument, while children laughed nearby and sprinklers hissed softly across the fresh grass. Looking at the scene, I almost felt guilty because none of those families had created the problem. They simply trusted the people running their association. I kept reminding myself that my disagreement was never with the homeowners. It was with someone who had spent years confusing authority with ownership. 2 days before the auction, another certified letter arrived, demanding immediate payment of accumulated HOA fines plus legal costs. According to the final page, failure to comply would result in additional enforcement actions. I smiled, placed the letter inside my binder without opening my laptop or making a single phone call, and returned to sanding the old cedar fence post I had been restoring. Fine sawdust drifted through the afternoon sunlight, while the familiar scent of cedar filled the air again. The quiet felt different now, not uncertain, patient. Auction day arrived beneath a bright blue Texas sky. Inside the county administration building, only a handful of investors occupied the folding chairs. Most were interested in vacant lots or abandoned commercial properties. Nobody even glanced at the forgotten parcel identified by its long tax account number. When bidding opened, I raised my bidder card once. Another investor hesitated, checked his notes, and shook his head. Less than 2 minutes later, the gavel came down with a soft wooden knock that echoed through the room. There were no cheers, no applause, and no celebration. Just one signature after another, as the paperwork quietly changed the future of an entire neighborhood, without anyone inside Willow Creek Estates realizing it had already happened. The deed was officially recorded just after 9:30 that morning, and by the time I drove back toward the ranch, the county database had already updated the ownership record. That was when everything unfolded exactly the way Diane had planned, just not for the person she expected. My phone rang while I was tightening the final bolts on the cedar fence post I had started repairing days earlier. A deputy politely informed me that someone from Willow Creek Estates had reported a trespassing complaint involving their entrance property. I thanked him for calling ahead and told him I would be waiting by the front gate. 20 minutes later, 3 patrol vehicles rolled slowly onto the gravel shoulder, their tires crunching against the same road Diane had spent weeks claiming belonged to her community. She stepped out almost immediately, wearing the same white blazer, carrying another thick folder, and smiling with complete confidence. Homeowners gathered along the sidewalks near the clubhouse, curious to see what would happen. The warm afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, while the new decorative flags near the entrance fluttered above perfectly trimmed flower beds. Diane spoke first, confidently explaining that I had interfered with community property, ignored association authority, and continued refusing to comply with neighborhood regulations despite repeated warnings. One deputy listened carefully before turning toward me. "Sir, is there anything you would like us to know?" I reached into the weatherproof document case resting inside my truck and removed a certified copy of the recorded deed. the title insurance commitment, the survey plat, and the county tax sale confirmation. The paper still felt crisp from the recorder's office. I handed the documents to the senior deputy without saying another word. Silence settled over the entrance while he slowly reviewed each page. His expression changed almost immediately. Then he unfolded the survey map across the hood of his patrol vehicle. Another deputy stepped closer. They compared parcel numbers, boundary descriptions, and recorded instrument references one line at a time. Finally, the senior deputy looked toward Diane. "Ma'am, according to these county records, the entrance monument, visitor parking area, clubhouse lot, and surrounding parcel are privately owned." Diane laughed nervously. "That is impossible. The association has maintained this property for years." The deputy nodded politely. "Maintenance and ownership are two different legal issues." I watched the color slowly leave her face as she stared at the survey map lying beneath the Texas sunlight. She hurriedly opened her own folder, flipping through architectural drawings, landscaping invoices, maintenance receipts, and meeting minutes. There was not a single recorded deed anywhere inside. Years of confidence disappeared beneath one simple county document. Homeowners standing nearby began whispering among themselves as they realized what the parcel lines actually showed. One gentleman quietly asked whether the clubhouse really sat on land the association did not own. The deputy simply pointed toward the survey. Every decorative flower bed, every stone pillar, every paved parking space that Diane had proudly called community property stood inside the parcel that now carried my name. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The only sound was the steady breeze moving through the cedar trees, while Diane looked from the monument to the survey map, as though the ground itself had quietly shifted beneath her polished shoes. My father used to tell me that the strongest foundations are built long before anyone notices them. Standing there that afternoon, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The following week, I received an email from the association's attorney requesting a meeting instead of another demand. That alone told me everything had changed. The conference room inside the clubhouse felt different from the first time I had walked through those doors. The polished wooden table was the same. The large windows still overlooked the carefully maintained lawn. The faint smell of fresh coffee still drifted from a machine in the corner. But confidence had been replaced with quiet caution. Diane sat across from me without the familiar stack of violation notices. Her folders now contained surveys, title reports, and legal opinions instead of architectural guidelines. For the first time since we met, she listened more than she spoke. Their attorney acknowledged that the recorded ownership documents were valid and asked whether I intended to close the entrance, remove the monument, or restrict access to the clubhouse. I looked out the window before answering. Children were riding bicycles along the sidewalk, while an elderly couple walked their dog beneath the shade of the same oak trees that had stood there long before any subdivision existed. None of those families had written threatening letters. None of them had claimed land they did not own. They simply trusted that the people leading them had done their homework. I told the attorney that I had no interest in punishing an entire neighborhood for the decisions of a few people. My goal had never been revenge. My goal was respect for property rights and an end to the false claims that had followed me since the day I moved onto my ranch. We spent the next several hours working through a simple agreement. The association would lease the entrance parcel, clubhouse grounds, and parking area through a long-term easement that clearly recognized legal ownership while guaranteeing uninterrupted access for every resident. In return, every outstanding violation notice issued against my property would be permanently withdrawn. All claims that my ranch belonged under association authority would be formally retracted, and future boards would acknowledge the recorded boundary lines exactly as they appeared in county records. The agreement was signed a few days later. New survey markers were installed along the property line, this time with everyone present, including county representatives, the survey crew, and members of the association board. Watching those brass caps disappear into the ground beneath the bright Texas sun felt strangely satisfying because they represented facts instead of opinions. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had once avoided conversation began stopping by the ranch again. Frank even laughed as he handed me a homemade pie, joking that I had probably taught more people about property law than any seminar the county had ever hosted. Diane eventually resigned as president, and the new board focused less on authority and more on transparency. I finished restoring my father's old workshop exactly the way I had planned when I first bought the land. Some evenings, I still sat on the cedar porch with a cup of black coffee, listening to meadowlarks while the last light settled across the pasture. The entrance monument remained exactly where it had always stood, but every time I drove past it, I remembered one lesson my father repeated throughout my childhood. Boundaries do not become real because powerful people believe in them. They become real because someone took the time to measure carefully, record honestly, and respect what was already there. In the end, nobody lost a neighborhood, nobody lost a home, and nobody needed to raise their voice. The only thing that truly changed was that the truth finally caught up with the paperwork, because justice is never the loudest person in the room. It is the quiet signature at the bottom of the right deed.